This week we're going to be looking at Chapter 3. The title of this chapter is The Emergence of Colonial Societies, 1625 to 1700. You need to make sure that you read Chapter 3 entirely and do all the MindTap quizzes by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Now, the PowerPoint that you're looking at says Chapters 3 and 4, but we're just only going to hit the high points of Chapter 3. This is not going to be an exhaustive look at what's there, so that's why you need to read it on your own. As we go through this, you need to take notes so that you will have that information and be prepared for any test or quiz that may come up in the future. Now, the first thing we want to look at as we get into this Chapter 3 is the difference between the Chesapeake area and the New England area. Now, let me just kind of clarify what areas those are. You can stop the video if you need to and go look at a map. But the Chesapeake Bay is the area on the coast of Virginia. And then if you think about Maryland, the state of Maryland, it comes down to like a peninsula type thing and is on the opposite side of the bay from Virginia. So the area inside with Maryland on the east and Virginia on the west, that is the Chesapeake area. And so the colonies that were established there, first of all, was Jamestown, and then there were others, and then later the Maryland colonies came along. But that's the region we're speaking of. And then, of course, New England, primarily we're going to be talking about Massachusetts, although it includes other sections of New England as well. But let's talk starting about in Virginia. Now, if you recall, Virginia was started when the colony of Jamestown was founded. Now, remember, Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in the United States, what's now the United States. It was founded in 1607. It is not the first permanent European colony in the United States. That belongs to St. Augustine in Florida, which was founded by the Spanish in, I believe, 1565. So it is not the first, Jamestown's not the first European, but it is the first English. Now, they were settled there. Remember, the colonists came to Jamestown looking for riches. They had been hearing about the Spanish and all the gold they had found, so they came looking for that. Of course, they did not find it, and we know that, and you know the stories about Pocahontas and John Smith and John Rolfe and the others about all the things that were going on there. Now, eventually, they did find out that tobacco was something that could be profitable. They discovered that from the Indians, and people in Europe became fond of chewing it, sniffing it, and smoking it, and so it became very profitable. So these people that came to Virginia discovered that they could make a lot of money doing that. Now, when they came, remember, they came to Virginia not seeking religious freedom. They came for money. And so that leads to a lot of things. First of all, not very many women came. Life there was hard. Life was difficult. But because they were coming for money, it was primarily a man's world. Young men that didn't inherit land from their fathers came, etc. So there were not a lot of women. Only about a third of the people that came were actually women. But also they were not seeking religious freedom, so they came and they brought with them the official Church of England, which is the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Okay, if you'll recall, the Anglican Church had split away from the Catholic Church in the 1500s when King Henry VIII became upset with the Pope because he would not grant an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon when she was unable to provide him a male heir, at least one that lived long enough to become an heir. So he just broke away and formed the Church of England and put himself in charge of the Church of England, and that's where that came from. But the Anglican Church retained a lot of the formal ceremony and things of the Catholic Church. We'll talk about that later. But the Anglicans came to Virginia with the colonists that came there, and it was the official religion there. The colonists were expected to be in attendance if there was actually a priest in town for that Sunday. One of the problems they had was that there was a shortage of priests because not a lot of priests wanted to come from England to Virginia because it was such a hard place to live. And so they did not have a lot of priests there, but if there was a priest in town, the people were expected to attend. They were also required to pay taxes or tithes to the church there, and that's something that was going on. One thing they did not do in Virginia was they did not educate their own priests. That's why they relied on them to come from England. They also in Virginia, one of the things that they did was because they were so far from the king and from England, they did have a governor that was appointed, but they also established their own legislature, which had two chambers. One of them was the House of Burgesses, elected from among the people. I might say that it was landowners, the big landowners that had a vote, and there was also the governor's council, which was a permanent, a lifetime appointment from the governor there, and they were kind of the rulers. So democracy, a form of democracy, a representative type democracy, really began from the very earliest stages there in Virginia. Now, Maryland was started. Maryland is just kind of north and east of Virginia. Maryland was started because a lord in England named Lord Baltimore was a Catholic. Now, if you know anything about the religious history of this period in England, but in the 1600s, to be anything besides the Church of England was to be persecuted and to not have a lot of freedom. It was very difficult. And he, as a Catholic, did not get to worship freely. I mean, he could have his own private priest in his home, but he could not freely go to church, that kind of stuff. So Lord Baltimore went to the king, and he convinced the king that there needed to be a colony for Catholics where they could go and they could worship freely. So the king granted him a colony, a grant there, which he named Maryland because, the Catholic Church honors the Virgin Mary. And so he named it Maryland in honor of the Virgin Mary. And they established the colony, and Catholics were able to go there. Now, even from the very earliest days, Catholics were not the primary people that went there. It was mostly Anglicans that wound up going there. And so despite the fact that the Catholics technically should have had religious freedom, the Anglicans ruled. They had the vast majority of the population, and in their legislature there in Maryland, they discriminated against the Catholics. And so it really never did truly grant the Catholics the type of religious freedom that they needed. Now, remember, when people came to the New World, for the most part, and they were seeking religious freedoms, the one that sought religious freedom, they were coming not so that everyone could have religious freedom, but so they could have religious freedom. Now, in 1649, the assembly there in Maryland, which was dominated by Protestants or Church of England people, passed a law called the Act of Religious Toleration, or Act for Religious Toleration. This was supposed to allow Catholics and Anglicans to have freedom of worship and toleration towards one another. It was not very successful, and eventually, a few years later, they repealed that law. Okay, it just was a very challenging time there for Catholics, especially in Baltimore. Now, the city that was founded and later became the capital was named after Lord Baltimore, and so that's why it got its name. Now, there were a lot of problems in the Chesapeake area, Virginia, Maryland, etc. 90% of the immigrants that came to the Chesapeake region were indentured servants. Indentured servants were basically slaves. They were poor people who lived in England or Ireland and who agreed to come to the region basically as a slave, usually for a period of 4 to 7 years. So the agreement was the person that was entering into the contract with the servant would guarantee that they would pay their way over to the New World, and they would provide a home and a place to live, and food and things like that. And the servant would work for them for 4 to 7 years most times, sometimes as much as 10 or 12, or maybe fewer years, depending on the situation. So the vast majority of people that came, of these 90% that were indentured servants, were men, because mostly they wanted male servants to work in the fields. So it was very difficult to find a bride if you were a man living in the Chesapeake area. Only about a third of male colonists actually wound up finding a bride. Now, that actually gave women a little bit of power, because then they could choose between the men they wanted, and so they could choose someone that would be a better match for them. They could choose someone that maybe had more money, more land, etc. They also had the advantage of being able to inherit the land if their husband died, because one of the problems they had in the Chesapeake area was they had a lot of tropical type diseases like malaria, cholera, typhoid, those kind of diseases. And so life expectancy for a man in the Chesapeake region was only about 48 years, and about 44 years for a woman. It was slightly higher in England than it was here. But the women often found themselves widows, and they would inherit their husband's land. So that gave them a little more position to choose someone that they could then marry that would help them out. in whatever way where they could have a little more say in what was going on. Because they tried to use plantations and things to grow the tobacco, they did not have close-knit communities or towns. They had a few towns, but not many. Most people had few residents. It was just very, very difficult. Because they were primarily plantations and there were few towns, there was not really a growth of a merchant class where people bought and sold and traded things for a living. As this population grew and you had a large number of indentured servants that were eventually becoming free, these men, yes, they could be free and they often got land, but the land they got was inferior in quality and did not bring them a lot of wealth. So the gap between the extremely wealthy plantation owners and the very poor indentured servants, and then later free men who really could never get ahead, continued to grow. Now, eventually, like starting in 1620, as I mentioned, tobacco became very important and it became a cash crop, and they made a lot of money. Some of the planters made many, many millions of dollars in today's money in that particular field of work. Now, eventually, you had a situation that came about in 1676 called Bacon's Rebellion. Let me explain what was going on. There were Native Americans that lived there, of course, and so the colonists often clashed with Native Americans. There were some who were peaceful and got along with the colonists just fine. There were others who did not like the fact their land was being taken and would often raid these settlements and plantations and things in Virginia especially. And so Governor Berkeley had a relative who was a distant relative named Nathaniel Bacon, who came to Virginia in April of 1676, and he was granted permission by the governor to gather up some men and to go and to find these non-peaceful natives and bring an end to the conflict. So 300 colonists joined with Bacon, and he was their leader. Well, as Bacon and his men went out, they did not find any of the warring tribes. What they found were peaceful ones, and they wound up massacring peaceful natives in their villages, and so that did not sit so well. Eventually, Bacon demanded that Governor Berkeley grant them permission to wage war against all Indians in general, mainly so they could get more land, is what they wanted. Berkeley was a little bit intimidated by them, so he wound up giving them authority, but the assembly defined these natives, these enemies, as any Indians who left their villages without English permission. And even if they were afraid of Bacon and left because of that, that gave them permission then to attack. Bacon's troops were free to seize any enemy Indians' food and possessions and keep the prisoner Native Americans as slaves if they wanted to. Now, Berkeley eventually, pretty quickly actually, had second thoughts and decided he needed to revoke that policy, and he called Bacon's men back. By this time, Bacon had 1,300 men with him. So his force had grown by 1,000 at this point. When Berkeley revoked their permission, they marched on Jamestown, which was the capital. Governor Berkeley wound up fleeing. Bacon and his men wound up burning the capital there in Jamestown. And the rebels then offered freedom to any of Berkeley's supporters, servants or slaves. So anybody who was one of his supporters, their servants or slaves could be given freedom if they joined the uprising and looted the enemy's plantations. Just as they were beginning to have a lot of triumph, Bacon came down with dysentery, which is a bad case of diarrhea, and he wound up dying because, they didn't have medication back then, so you could become very dehydrated and die quickly from diseases like that. So Bacon wound up dying. Now, the problem, or the significance of this, the reason why this is important, why we study it and why we want to talk about it, is because up to this point, this is 1676, in the Chesapeake region, they primarily, especially in Virginia, primarily used indentured servants, which would eventually gain their freedom as the people to work their plantations and things. Now, they had already begun to import slaves from Africa and some African-descended slaves from the West Indies, which would be the Caribbean area. They had already begun to do that. But at this point, the ruling class in Virginia, the merchant class, the planter class, became very afraid of these indentured servants. So what this did was this marked a major shift in Virginia from using primarily indentured servants to work their fields and things like that to now using African descended slaves to work their field. And these slaves would be permanent slaves. They were not indentured servants. They would not be given freedom. And it also became a part of the law. They put this in their law. They codified slavery into Virginia's legal system. And so it was a marked difference. So it's very significant. You need to remember Bacon's Rebellion marked this major change in Virginia, which eventually would transfer to the whole South, but in Virginia from indentured servitude as their primary source of servants to African slavery as their primary source. So that's very important that you keep that in mind and remember that, okay? Now, let's switch gears and talk about New England for a minute. New England is north of there, of course. Massachusetts is the primary region we're going to talk about. We know that in New England, it was in Massachusetts especially, it was settled by Pilgrims in about 1619, and then they had their first Thanksgiving shortly after that. I believe it was 1621. And the Pilgrims were a religious group of people called the Puritans. Let me explain who the Puritans were. The Puritans were a group of people who had broken away from the Anglican Church. Now, let's remember, the Anglican Church broke away from the Catholic Church. The Puritans believed that the Anglican Church, which retained a lot of the pomp and circumstance and formality of the Catholic Church, needed to be purified. And so that's why they were called Puritans. And they were very strict. They did not believe in a hierarchy. A hierarchy is what a lot of churches have, like the Catholic Church, the Anglican or Episcopal Church here in America, Lutherans, Methodists, etc., have bishops and others that are oversee a general area of churches. And the bishops have ultimate authority in that area of churches. The Puritans did not like that. They didn't believe in that. They believed that each congregation should be independent and ruled by the men who were adult men who were members of that church. And so they were called Congregationalists. They believed that each congregation should be independent and ruled that way. And so they really wanted to purify the church and change the way things were done. Well, that didn't sit well. So, of course, they had to find a place to go. Eventually, some of them went to Holland or the Netherlands, and eventually they then came on as pilgrims to the New World and landed in Plymouth at Plymouth Rock. And we know the story of all of that. But this Puritanism was very strict. They were Calvinist in their teaching. Calvinism is a belief that God had predestined certain people to be going to heaven and certain people to go to hell. It included the idea that all people were depraved or were sinners and needed salvation, but only certain elect ones were predestined to be saved. They believed that if you were in the elect, you would persevere in good works for the remainder of your life, etc. So they were very strict in the way they looked at things, the way they did things. Now, when in 1630, 11 ships with 700 passengers under a man named Governor John Winthrop arrived at Boston, what became Boston. So there were already people there by this time. But they arrived, and Governor Winthrop distributed an essay called A Model of Christian Charity. And in this particular essay, he declared that Massachusetts shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. He took this quote from Scripture. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that you should let your light shine so that you can be like a shining city on a hill, letting the whole world see your good works. Okay? And so his idea was that these Puritans were going to go to New England and they were going to establish a society based on the biblical principles, or at least the principles they believed the Bible taught. And that society would then be like a shining city on the hill, showing the whole world how a society can be good if that society is ruled by these biblical principles. And so as they got there, they established their own way of doing things. They had what was called the New England way. In England, the Puritans, someone could join a Puritan church as long as they professed a conversion experience. In other words, a time where they had come to know Christ as their Savior and turned from their sin. But they also would have to make sure they knew the Calvinist doctrines that the Puritans believed. And then they could be baptized and be part of the church. In New England, they changed it a little bit. Not only did you have to make the right confession of doctrines, the Calvinist doctrines, but you also had to have a convincing story of your conversion experience, and then you had to have a life that backed it up. So you couldn't just have this conversion experience today and join the church today. No, you had to have a period of time in your life where you had lived and your life reflected these Christian morality and principles that you supposedly believed and as a converted person lived by. And so it was very difficult to become a member of the church. And so as time progressed through the 1600s, a smaller and smaller percentage of the population of New England were becoming members of the church. They might go to church, and they even institute a system where you could have halfway membership, where you can express the conversion experience, but weren't all the way there yet, So it was very, very difficult. But one of the unique things they did, because they were Congregationalists, they believed that every church should rule itself. And so all the male members, and they called them saints, all the male saints of the church who were adults could vote in the church. So when they established their communities in New England, then what they would do is, to get a land grant, several dozen men or families would be given a land grant for a certain area. They would go, and the way they would do it is they'd build a village or a town, and they would have a meeting house in the middle of town. The meeting house is where they had school, it's where they had church, it's where they had their town meetings. And then all the homes and stuff would be clustered around the church. And if you go to New England towns today, you'll see they're still basically set up the same way, the small towns. Still basically set up the same way, because that's the way they were done back then. And then the farmland would be outside the town, okay, kind of around it. And so the way they set up their government system was, rather than having a town council or whatever, every male saint was allowed to vote. Now, in England and in Virginia, you could only vote if you were a male who owned a lot of land. But in New England, you didn't have to own any land at all. But if you were a male saint, you could vote. So a higher percentage of men were allowed, about 50% were permitted to vote, whereas in other colonies and in England, it was only about 30% or less. And so it became a much more democratic way of doing things. In New England towns and villages, they had a town meeting every so often, usually once a year, and if they needed it more often, they would. And in those town meetings, they would make their rules. Everybody would vote on it. All the male saints would vote on it. And New England towns still run the same way today. If you're an adult male or woman now who is eligible to vote, and you live inside one of those towns or villages, you go to the town meetings and you vote on decisions. You don't have a council. You don't have a mayor. You run it by the town meeting, okay? And they still do it that way today in the smaller towns and villages. But the New England way was different than anyone else. Now, one of the things that was unique about the New England way is they wanted to educate their children. It wasn't so their children could have a better station in life, because one of the things they, as Calvinists, believed was that God had predestined some to be rich and some to be poor, but they needed to be servants to one another and help one another and be kind to one another. They get rid of the class warfare. But they weren't trying to educate their children so they could have a better station in life. They were trying to educate their children because they wanted their children to be able to read the Bible and understand it, okay? So every town and village required schooling for every child so they could learn to read the Bible. So you had literacy rates that were very, very high, maybe 70% or higher in these New England communities where people could read and write. Whereas in other places in England and other colonies, it was 30% or fewer. And so it really was amazing how literate they became, and that led to a lot of significant things later. Another thing that they wanted to do was they wanted to educate their own ministers in the New England way. You know, Virginia had problems recruiting ministers because they didn't have a college to train them, and people didn't want to come from England to Virginia. So New England just decided to start their own. So they started their own college in 1636, known as Harvard. Today we call it Harvard University. It's still in Cambridge, Massachusetts to this day. And it was meant to train ministers for the gospel. From 1642 to 1671, they had 201 graduates. Out of those, 111 of them were ministers. And in New England was the only part of America in those days where you could have your own college-educated people. If you wanted a college education in any other colony, you either had to go to New England or you had to go back to England or some other European country to get that education. So it was quite an interesting situation. Now, the Puritans had come to New England for religious freedom, but remember, they came for their own religious freedom, not everybody else's. So Quakers and others were not treated well. They were allowed to worship on as they wanted to, but they were not treated well, and they were looked down upon and caused problems, and were given problems by the Puritans. Well, one person that they did not care for was a man named Roger Williams. He was, as far as we know, the first Baptist preacher in the United States, or what's now the United States. He came to New England, and I think he arrived there in Massachusetts in 1631, and he promoted religious tolerations because Baptists, as long as they've been around, have believed that church and state should be separate and that people should be allowed to worship according to the freedoms of their conscience. In other words, they believed in religious toleration. That was new. Nobody else really believed that, so this was something nobody else really wanted to hear, but that's what he preached. And so he wanted separation of church and state and religious toleration or religious freedom for all people. He did not believe the government should have any connection to religious matters at all. Okay. Williams started becoming more popular as he preached what he preached, and Winthrop and the other authorities said that he was subversive, and they banished him from the colony. So he went west and formed a place called Providencetown. Today it's known as Providence. Eventually he was given a charter and founded the colony of Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the first colony in America that allowed religious freedom or religious toleration. Okay, we have the freedom of religion as part of our Bill of Rights because of what Roger Williams and the Baptists did when they came here to America as colonists. Okay, so Rhode Island practiced religious toleration and allowed religious freedom no matter what you were, whether you were Jewish or Catholic or Quaker or Puritan or Baptist or whatever. Now, another person that gave the Puritans some fits was a woman named Anne Hutchison. She was a member of the Boston Puritan Congregation or Congregational Church. And she publicly criticized the clergy because she said they judged people based on their works, and that was too much like the Catholic Church, that the whole Protestant Reformation had been fought to not to be judged based on your good works. And so she did not like it, so she criticized them. Well, she was a woman, and they did not appreciate being criticized by a woman. So they put her on trial, and in the trial, she actually held her own against those preachers. She knew the Bible as well or better than they did. Anytime they were trying to accuse her of something, she was able to use Scripture to combat what they were saying and prove them wrong. And eventually, they just banished her. So where'd she go? She went to Rhode Island. That was the place where she could go and be free. Now, town life in Massachusetts in New England was very interesting. You had your villages that were close knit. The men usually went and worked out in the farmland during the day. And in fact, these Puritans believed that farming was the godly way to do it. They were not big fans of the merchant class of people, which was a growing class of people in Boston and Salem Village, that is. And so it was very. There were a lot of tensions between the farmers and the merchants. But the women stayed home and helped educate the children, take care of things. So the women actually became pretty influential because they were in constant communication with one another there in town while the men were out working in the fields. And they were able to be very influential. And even though they didn't have official power, they did have some power just because of that very, very way of meeting and being convincing. Health in New England was much better than it was in the Chesapeake area because they didn't have tropical diseases and because they had managed to have better returns on their crops. They wound up having a life expectancy for men of about 65 years, and women were just almost that long. So they lived almost 20 years longer on average than the people in the Chesapeake region did. Also, something that was unique is their infant mortality rate was very low. About 80% of infants born in New England were raised to lived long enough to get married. In Virginia and the Chesapeake region, that number was probably less than 30% or so. They had larger families in New England because their children did live longer. So they weren't replacing children. They just kept adding to. And so they had bigger families and things like that. Now, there's more you can read than you need to make sure you read, but Briefly, I want to talk about the Salem witch trials, and I really need you to do some research on your own on this. I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot, but it's something that was very important and very significant. Salem witch trials. Now, people back then believed in witchcraft. Okay, that they believed that witches existed, and I'm not talking about witches like the Wiccan religion. I'm talking about witches that could fly on brooms and cast spells and put curses on you. That's what they believed in. Almost everybody believed that. And so it's just something that was accepted as a fact. And you can actually go back and read literature from that time period and before that talked about witchcraft and witches and told stories of witches flying on to these meetings on their brooms and stuff. In fact, that was supposedly happened in Massachusetts during this time. But they began to have trials starting in February of 1692 and lasted till May of 1693. It became quite a fiasco. 342 people were accused of being witches or warlocks. Including some preachers and other very good, upstanding members of the community and church and business leaders and things like that. They wound up convicting 20 and executing them. Execution was done by hanging. Now, in Europe, they might burn a witch at the stake or something like that, but that was not something that happened in New England. They just hung them by the neck until they died. One person named Corey Giles died from torture. He had been accused of being a witch or a warlock, actually, and they began to question him. He refused to answer their questions, so they decided, well, if you're not going to answer questions, we're just going to force you to confess, or at least force you to answer. And so they forced him to lie down on the ground, and they began to put big rocks on him. It's called pressing. And they kept putting more and more rocks on him and asking questions. He still refused to answer until finally he had the life squeezed out of him and he was dead. There are several causes that have been put forth as potential reasons for this. Let me help you understand that in history, things are very complex, and we're only can just in a survey course just only kind of hit the highlights. They're probably much more complex than we're actually going to be able to research and hear and talk about. But there were political tensions, which made things difficult. There had been a revolution in England. They had beheaded one king and then had a dictator and then got a new king. And some of those political tensions poured over into New England and caused problems. Think about our own country right now. We have political tensions here, and it's to the point to where if you are on one side or the other, people look down on you just because of that. And so it causes tension in life. There was warfare with the Native Americans. Salem was only about 70 miles from the frontier. There had been a lot of warfare going on. So there had been a lot of people that had fled that warfare and come into Salem. There were young children who were orphans who had come to live there. Well, there were always rumors that they were about to be attacked by the Native Americans. If you feel like someone's standing behind every tree ready to shoot you or scalp you or whatever the case may be, that causes a lot of tension. There were socioeconomic tensions between Salem town and Salem village. That was two different places. Salem village was on the coast. It was the more prosperous areas where the merchants were. Salem town is now Danvers, Massachusetts, but it was much more rural. They did have a church, but there were a lot of disagreements in that church. There were two factions, two families and their groups that caused a lot of trouble. They couldn't keep a preacher for any length of time. But the people in Salem town were poor by and large. The people in Salem village were wealthy, and they just looked down on each other. And there were a lot of tensions between the two. There was jealousy from the Salem town people towards the Salem village people, and then there was just arrogance from the Salem village people towards the Salem town people. Most of the accusers were people from Salem town. Most of the accused were from Salem village. Religious life was very taxing and difficult. We didn't just go to church for an hour, but you went for several hours. You were expected to live by certain standards. You were expected to read the Bible a certain amount of time each day and to say your prayers every day. Fun was not really allowed at all. It was just very difficult and very tense. There's one historian that put forth the idea that maybe some of the wheat that they had stored up for the winter to make their bread out of had grown a fungus called ergot, which is basically like LSD. If that's the case, then perhaps some of these people were basically on a drug trip and hallucinating. That theory is not well or widely accepted, and I don't think it's probably an accurate one just because it was not enough people. If it were that widespread, I think more people would have had hallucinations and those crazy events. So I don't believe that, but it could have happened, and it's a legitimate theory. The weather. That far north, it's dark most of the day during the winter. There's very few hours of daylight. It's cold. It's wet. And there's a thing called seasonal affective disorder that literally, if you don't get enough sunlight and it's dreary outside, it changes your brain chemistry and you can go into clinical depression. So most likely, a lot of people suffered from that. It's called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. A lot of people suffered from that during in that part of the world. Some still do. That's still a problem up there now. At least they know what it is now. And also, there's mass hysteria. If you believe that witches exist, and your part of your religion teaches that if something bad happens, it's because either God's punishing you or the devil's after you. Well, if something bad's happened, what are you going to do? And you think there are witches, and somebody else has already seen witches or had been attacked by witches, and now your crop fails, or your house catches on fire, or your child dies, or you get sick, and you had an argument with a neighbor the other day. Well, maybe that neighbor is a witch and they put a curse on you, or maybe they looked at you funny and cursed you. And so it just kind of breeds and grows from there. It's kind of like coronavirus today. If you sneeze, everybody's like, "Oh, are you sick? Do you have coronavirus?" It's just almost like a mass hysteria, only it was way worse then. The three first accusers were young girls named Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and Ann Putnam Jr. I say young girls; they were probably preteens or early teens. They writhed around on the floor and barked like dogs and claimed that the specter or spirits of these women they accused were pinching them or poking them or biting them. My personal opinion is that they were just bored and mean, and they picked three outcasts, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, and blamed them and accused them of being witches, and it went from there. Now, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were just kind of old women who were kind of crotchety. One of them was a beggar and really didn't have a place of her own. The other was just not very nice. And Tituba was a slave who had originally come from South America. I believe she was of African descent, but she had come from South America. And so she was exotic and weird and practiced weird things. And so they said she took them out and taught them witchcraft. And when they interviewed Tituba, and you can look up her transcripts online if you want to, and see just what she said when they asked her questions, because they published it online. Of course, they didn't publish it back then, but you know what I mean. It's there now. She told fantastic stories of people flying on brooms and of the devil appearing as a tall man in all black, or as a canary, or as a black cat, or something like that, and that told these stories of these people who had signed his book, and they had become witches because they signed that. When you signed the book, you entered into a pact with the devil and you'd get power, but he took your soul, that kind of stuff. In the trials, they did something that they did not allow in most witch trials around Europe at that time, and that was they allowed spectral evidence. Spectral evidence means that if someone claimed to see someone's spirit tormenting them or doing something, they would allow that as evidence. In most cases before this, spectral evidence was not allowed in court because it was something that could not be proven, but they did allow it for some reason. Now, eventually, these people were exonerated. Now, for the 300th anniversary in the 1990s, the governor of Massachusetts officially pardoned the 20 who had been convicted and executed for their murder for witchcraft. The rest of them were the ones who were accused but never quite made it to trial. They were kind of exonerated at that point. Another effect is that it helped end Puritan New England. It made the Puritans look bad. It just made the Puritans look bad. So it just kind of ended their stronghold and grasp that they had on New England society, because they just, people were like, I don't think I'm going to go with that anymore. And people turned away from the church into more self-interest. Now, we have developed a term in our society called a witch hunt. And it's happened throughout our society. In the 1950s, we had the second Red Scare, where they were looking for communists. And if you were accused of being a communist in the 1950s, you could lose your job, your family, your career, all kinds of things. Today, in our political world, if you're on one side of the political spectrum, you might be called a Nazi or a fascist. If you're on the other side, you might be called a communist. So this kind of stuff still happens. It just may not be being accused of being a witch, maybe something else. All right, well, that's going to be it for this lesson. Make sure you get your mind tap done and you read this chapter, and I hope you have a good day.